Hey there, Dr. Alan Christianson here, and I want to talk about saturated fats and heart disease. So there was a time in which we thought that it was such an obvious thing that we found plaque in damaged blood vessels. And long about the rate of 1960s, the rate of heart disease was skyrocketing. There were so many early deaths from that. It's slowed, but it's still very high. And sadly, in a third of the cases, the very first sign of heart disease is a fatal heart attack. So it totally sneaks up on people. Researchers saw that those who had heart attacks had fatty plaque built up blocking the blood vessels that give blood to the heart muscle. And it seemed very intuitively logical that if there's this fatty, waxy, cholesterol-based stuff here, then somehow what we're eating must end up there. It seemed like a very simple cause and effect. There's a lot more complexity to it than that by far, but that's gone through cycles of understanding. So that was thought to be one of the main culprits, was just dietary cholesterol and dietary fats in general, especially saturated fat. So let's talk about the understanding and how it's evolved over the years and what the best science tells us today. So for starters, what is a fat? Well, chemically, a fat is a hydrocarbon. That means it's a molecule made up of just two atoms, carbon and hydrogen. Now the carbons make a long chain and the hydrogens fill in around the carbons. I won't go too deep in Chem 101, but carbons can make up to 4 bonds. So a carbon can bond to a neighbor carbon, or it can bond twice to a neighbor carbon. But it can only make 4 bonds. So if it bonds twice to a neighbor carbon, then that means it has fewer spots by which it could bond with hydrogen. So a saturated fat means saturated with hydrogen. So if you've got an 18-chain carbon fat and every single carbon has hydrogens all around it, and the end ones have carbons on 3 places, well, that is now saturated. You couldn't jam more hydrogen in anywhere in that. But if that same chain has several double bonds, several places where carbon bonds to another carbon twice, well, now that's one spot that a hydrogen cannot occupy. So it is not saturated with hydrogen. We call it an unsaturated fat. And if we have a single double bond like that, well, single for one, so that's a mono unsaturated fat. And if we have a lot of double bonds like that, we would call that a poly for many, a poly unsaturated fatty acid. And the last part is based on where, so we've got the alpha end and the omega end. And starting at the omega end, we count up carbon atoms, and wherever that first double bond appears past that omega end, that's one of the ways that we categorize the fat. So it's a really simple thing. You guys are seeing this. If we're going down in this carbon omega end, we go 1, 2, 3 carbons up, and we put in a double bond. Now we've got an omega-3 unsaturated fat. So it's that easy. So what does the saturation really do on a physical level? Well, a fat and an oil, sometimes those terms are used interchangeably, but specifically a fat is something that is solid at room temperature. Right now it's probably about 75 degrees in this room. And if I had coconut oil, lard, Crisco, butter, they would be solid. To be precise, coconut oil is the quickest one to liquefy. That would be about like 89, 90 degrees, just above, that would start to liquefy. But room temperature, as we define it, that's really a fat, to be more precise. So coconut fat could be arguably more correct than coconut oil. But the difference is that the more saturated the fat is, the more easily it stacks up, and the more easily it fits together neatly with the adjoining molecules. So it stays solid, kind of like making ice from water. Whereas an unsaturated fat, it can't stack up as easily, and it remains liquid even at lower temperatures. We call that a less saturated fat. Now, this came to also fit into the concepts around heart disease when some Inuit populations were thought to have very low rates of heart disease despite high-fat diets. So in the past, called Eskimos, the Alaskan Native Americans, diets were very high in marine fats, and yet they had lower rates of heart disease. Now, oddly enough, I've looked at some of the research, that's now held to be a myth. So footnote on that, they probably don't have low rates of heart disease, and they probably didn't. But you could imagine that if you were an Arctic sea mammal and you had saturated fat in your system it would just glom up. It would not circulate with cold water adjacent to your vessels. So in colder environments, one needs to have more unsaturated fats to move around. And also with plants. So all the plant versions of saturated fats, which would be like coconut or palm fats, those are found predominantly in tropical areas where there's warmer weather. If it was too cold, those fats would make the plant unable to circulate. Now, to go a little bit deeper, we often categorize a type of an oil or a fat based upon the predominant fat that it contains. So we'll call coconut oil or coconut fat a saturated fat, and we may call olive oil a monounsaturated fat. But to be really precise, all of these food sources, all these fats, are not one type or another type. They're all blends. They're all blends of various types of fats, poly, mono, and saturated. So right now there's a lot of thought about polyunsaturates being bad. That's a very popular fad belief you'll hear about. And people say, yeah, you should never have a speck of polyunsaturated fats. Well, guess what? You get a speck of polyunsaturated fats with coconut oil and with lard and with butter. You cannot avoid them. All these things are blends. We really categorize them based upon their predominant fat, but none are exclusively one nor the other. So again, saturated fat plant foods, pretty much coconut and palm, the tropical fats, not really much else. And not to say that none of the plant oils have no saturated fat. It's just that they don't predominantly give saturated fat for their contents. Now, in terms of animal sources, most animal fats are primarily saturated fats. So we think about concentrated dairy fats, especially butter, cheeses, as being very dense sources of saturated fats. And then also, there's small amounts of saturated fat even in lean poultry, higher amounts in dark meat poultry, higher amounts in pork, and then higher amounts in mammal meats in general. So the thing that comes up a lot is grass-fed meat, grass-fed beef. And people talk about grass-fed beef being less saturated and being a higher source of omega-3 fats. And it's true, it is, but the degree matters. And the numbers, the devil's in the details. I love that little phrase, it tells so much. So I found an assay, I've seen this data before, but I found a recent assay looking at omega-3 fats in commercial beef versus grass-fed beef. The idea is that grass contains precursors to omega-3 fats. Grass has alpha-linolenic acid, and mammals that are herbivorous, like cows, they can convert that alpha-linolenic acid into omega-3 fats, sometimes better than omnivores like us can do. So the argument is that if cows eat more grass, cows will have more omega-3 fat. Now let's give some context. Omega-3 fats are super important. We need them for just all facets of brain function, cell metabolism, inflammation regulation. And the quantities, the amounts we need, are upwards of 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams on a daily basis. So a couple thousand milligrams. So how much? So yes, grass-fed beef is higher in omega-3 fats than commercial beef. But does that mean that it's a substantial source and that it's really contributing in a meaningful way towards that day's total? Well, the numbers in the recent assay showed that commercial beef per a typical serving size is probably going to be as low as 20 milligrams of omega-3 fat. So remember, we need to get about 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams per day. So let's say 2,000 milligrams a day, easy math. So 100 hamburgers, 100 hamburgers could give you your intake of omega-3 fats. Now we know that omega-3 fats are important to get the right amount, but we also know that it's really about the ratios of those to other fats in the diet. So even though you may you may squeak by that 2,000 milligram number on those 100 hamburgers, guess what? You're going to be so over on, yes, hamburgers have omega-6 fats, and yes, they have saturated fats and arachidonic acid. So those things will be very disproportionate to the omega-3 fats. They also have polyunsaturated fats, which many are fearful of nowadays. They actually have a lot more polyunsaturated fats than they have of even the saturated fats or the omega-3 fats. So let's look at grass-fed beef, since it's higher in omega-3 fats. It is. So that 20 milligrams is actually 55 milligrams per serving. So this is still not a rich source of omega-3 fats, and it's not predominantly omega-3 fats. So that 100 hamburgers now comes down to roughly 40 hamburgers to hit the target. So it's kind of like being I don't know, the tallest building in Kansas. I mean, my apologies to those from Kansas, but not known for big buildings. So just brief aside on that, grass-fed is not radically different for saturated fat or omega-3 content. And actually the saturated fat assays on grass-fed beef versus commercial beef are also quite similar. In terms of quantities, commercial beef, you'll see about 9 grams of saturated fat per serving, and grass-fed beef, you might see about 8.2 grams of saturated fat per serving. So in the big picture, this is a high saturated fat, low omega-3 food. Doesn't matter if it's commercial or grass-fed, that doesn't change it. A couple of things that I did not mention as far as other animal sources of saturated fats would really be eggs and specifically egg yolks. You know, not so much found in the egg white, but really found in the yolk. So saturated fats are also categorized by how long they are. Fats in general are by how many carbon atoms they have. Some of the shorter ones, like butyric acid, for example, do really good things for our gut flora. The longer ones, we think about lauric, mysteric, palmitic, stearic acid. There can be subtle differences from type to type. There's not been a lot of research really looking at how one type performs in terms of human health outcomes over the other types. And that's mostly just because they're always found in some combination within foods. There are times where some foods are predominantly more one or the other, and it's arguable that perhaps they could act differently for that reason. But to date, we've had no large human studies really seeing if that difference is relevant or not. And last thing on our 101 discussion here is about cis versus trans fatty acids. So remember, we got this chain of C's, this chain of carbon atoms, and so far I talked about them as being more or less in a straight chain. So the reality is they're typically in a C-shaped chain. So we got C's in a C. So C carbon atoms, and we call that a cis fatty acid, and that's because of the shape of the molecule. Now imagine that these things all spoon, that they're all lying back to back. That's what a healthy cell membrane looks like. You've got a lot of cis-shaped fatty acids that fit together like pieces in a puzzle, and they allow for the cell to take in nutrients and excrete wastes. It's just like digestion to a cell for digestion to a living thing, and that's based upon the health and the integrity of that cell membrane. So what's a trans fatty acid? Well, when a fat becomes saturated under certain conditions, such as very high temperature or high pressure, then that can shift that C-shaped curve into an S-shaped curve. I'm not doing a wonderful job. There we go. Yeah, something like that. So here we got, yeah, I'd probably fail at shadow puppets. So rather than a nice gentle C all the way around, now we've got an S. We've cranked it over. We do see trans fats in animal fats, and then also hydrogenated and partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. Now, trans fats as an active ingredient, you don't find them that so much in foods anymore. It was the case not that long ago to where trans fatty acids were used directly in terms of partially hydrogenated soybean oil especially. You'd see this in so many products. So now, not so much, but what does happen is that a lot of baked goods that have oil and flour, so all the stuff inside the supermarket, not the lining of the supermarket, but the inside the supermarket stuff, things are often heated with high temperatures and oxygen-rich environments. That will form trans fatty acids. And trans fatty acids, their danger is so different that we're talking about milligrams can hurt you. I mean, seriously, a few hundred milligrams can be clearly harmful. And something that many of us have been upset about is the labeling guidelines. So the labeling guidelines are such to where anything less than a gram or 1,000 milligrams can be called zero as far as trans fatty acid content. Very misleading. So consumers can buy products that say zero trans fats, and they're not zero trans fats. They're below some threshold, but they've got enough to actually matter. This is more where the devil's in the details, and they can add up. So a big argument against a lot of those processed foods. So what do we know about saturated fats and heart disease? Well, there's different ways of answering this question. In clinical research, you can do first modeling or expert consensus. And that's like a thought experiment. That's almost like plaque in the blood vessels bad, plaque in the blood vessels contains saturated fat and cholesterol, so therefore saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet's bad. And that's a reasonable way to start a theory or to direct some research, but it's not conclusive. there's many ways by which thought experiments are just wrong, and they usually are. But they're good things to use as a springboard to legitimate science. Next up, we then have test tube studies, where we'll pour saturated fat on vessels or cells like those in blood vessels and see what they do. Also, a valid strategy towards directing further research, but not a basis to make decisions off of. So too for animal studies, the next level of research. What happens when animals consume this? So again, not conclusive, but worth launching research from. So meaningful research starts at the level of human outcome studies. What happens to people when they eat more or less saturated fat? And the more meaningful studies involve more people, more years, and more dramatic outcomes. So what I mean by that is, if you have populations that have 1% more heart disease, maybe you've got 10 people that have 1 more heart attack than these 10 people over the course of 2 years. Not very meaningful. So the more people, the more dramatic differences, the more years, the more weight we put on that. And the largest studies like this tend to be epidemiologic in nature, meaning you're tracking populations and tracking their outcomes. Now, there are shortcomings to all levels of science, including epidemiology, but nonetheless, the data from it is vastly superior to animal studies, test tube studies, and simple hypothesis. The best thing would be randomized controlled studies, which doesn't tend to happen much in nutrition because you can't get 1 million people to eat differently than another group for a long period of time. It just doesn't really happen. So oftentimes epidemiology is the top of the totem pole in nutrition research. And the populations we've seen, there's 2 populations that have had the most dramatic differences in heart disease than other populations. They're called the Tsimane from South America. I actually spent a lot of time looking at the pronunciation, and people that spent time with them, that's how they said it. I've seen others say Tsimane as well, or Chimane or Chimane. So that's my best shot at it from those that spent time with them was Tsimane. And then we've got the Okinawans. So they're an island population living off of Japan. And their rates of heart disease in both of these populations is literally 1/10 to 1/5 the rate that it is in modern populations. It's just dramatically different. The Tsimane was very well studied, in which they had nearly 1,000 people receive coronary artery CT scans. And that's one of the better ways. You can just see if there's plaque or not. It's visible, it's there, or it's not there. It's like so objective. And there's a normal amount of plaque that does form just from age. Age remains the biggest factor for heart disease. In the modern world, the older we get, the more plaque we form. But the Tsimane did not have plaque, and their old people didn't have plaque. They had one person in their 70s with a speck of plaque. That was really about it. They were basically plaque-free. And similar story for Okinawans and heart disease. Now, these populations both end up being on diets that are extremely low in saturated fats. The Tsimane average about 11 grams of saturated fat per day, which is about 4% of their calories. The Okinawans, probably about 2% of calories they consume from saturated fat. Most Americans average about 15, maybe even 20 in some cases for percent saturated fat from calories. Now, the reason we're even having this discussion was because a 2015 study just completely muddied the waters. A Time magazine article took this and ran with it. They said, "Is butter back?" And the study, actually one of the lead authors themselves, I can quote him, he said, "Our results suggest that butter should neither be demonized nor considered back as a route to good health." And that was a very responsible thing to say. So to demonize it was not realistic. A speck of butter here or there does not kill you. I guarantee that. And that's true for pretty much any other food that our grandparents could have eaten. We're omnivores. We're like flex fuel vehicles. We can do high octane, low octane, diesel, and by and large we can still get down the road. It may be still true that low octane will gum our lines sooner than high octane, but we'll still get down the road. So nothing really should be demonized in the diet. And that's what I think had gone too far, where we had demonized saturated fat and thought that the tiniest bits of it was just dangerous. The 2015 study, what it really did was it compared the effect of a certain amount of butter or saturated fats in the diet against that same amount of calories coming from refined grains like white flour processed products, sodas, sugar, red meat, French fries, or hydrogenated oils. So basically, butter versus those things, butter was no worse. Now, when you think about it, that's a pretty low bar. That's not saying, wow, this is a health food. It's saying it's not worse than trans fatty acids, or it's not worse than sugar, or it's not worse than French fries. No kidding. Those are the conclusions they drew from the study. It was not worse than those other foods. But something I really want you all not to get trapped into is the idea of binary thinking when it comes to foods. So foods are not evil and foods are not saviors. They're things that we need to fuel us, and it's all about the proportions and the dosages. So a certain amount of saturated fat, some level, is definitely harmless. And even if we're avoiding the high saturated fat foods completely, we still get a bit of saturated fat from anything that has any fat. And no one advocates a zero fat diet. No one has ever said that's a good idea. We need some fats. We cannot be free of saturated fats, and we should not be. They don't deserve to be demonized. But the flip side of that same mindset is to, I don't know, idolize something and to say, oh wow, if saturated fats are back, then saturated fats must be the best thing we should focus on and we should get lots of them. So another group took that message and then just went to town with it and said we need more and more saturated fats. They're actually good for us. Well, that data didn't exist. That data never existed. And in response to the 2015 study, there were some large studies in 2016 that looked at not just is saturated fat any worse than junk food, but they said, how does saturated fat compare to good food, like unprocessed carbohydrate or monounsaturated fats, or dare I say, polyunsaturated fats. And this was a very large, powerful study. This was an extension of the Nurses' Health study. And they tracked over 3 million people years to gather this data. And what they showed was that every amount of saturated fat that you substituted with an unprocessed carbohydrate meant an 8% reduction in mortality. And they even showed that every 5% saturated fat that you could trade out with polyunsaturated fats corresponded with a 26% reduction in mortality. So huge, radical health differences by doing a little less saturated fat and more good carbs or more unsaturated fats. And so far, by far, this was the largest study to date. So the consensus is that the more you can do fats from other sources or calories from other sources, the better you'll do for cardiovascular death. Now, this study also looked at total mortality, which is just whatever reason someone died from. Okay, so apart from heart disease and total mortality, what else do we know about saturated fat and its various risks? Well, we do know that it is a strong risk factor for prostate cancer. It is a risk factor for breast cancer. It is a risk factor for brain aging. It is a risk factor for type 1 diabetes, also for type 2 diabetes. I talked about mortality, and then also total risks towards weight gain. So how many studies have we seen in which saturated fat actually improves health outcomes? People actually do better from saturated fat. There have been none. There have been debates about how harmful it is and what level of it is best, but I've scoured and I found no studies showing that people that consume more saturated fats are healthier in terms of any health metrics. Now, I know you've probably heard otherwise, and I would argue that that data comes down from really speculation or at most test tube studies. But whenever we have data that is from higher levels of information, we want to go with that and pay attention to it. So what are your best recommendations? Well, probably 5 to 10% of calories. I've seen no strong evidence that there's harm from that. The one argument would be the Tsimane or the Okinawans. They were lower than that threshold, and there may be populations with more risk to where they're better off being below that. But most studies suggest that 5%, maybe 10% is likely harmless. With cardiovascular risk, most argue 5% or less. So what does that actually look like? Well, let's say that you're on a typical diet. If you're on even a Mediterranean diet or a standard American diet, you're probably already at 10 to 15% of calories from saturated fat. So that means actually reducing saturated fat. It's not a question of how much should you add or should you not add. It's really a question of reducing to get down to that threshold. Let's say that you're on a diet that has just no obvious sources of fat across the board, your total fat-free diet. In those cases, a tablespoon of butter in a diet that has just zero fat anywhere else would equal about 4% of your calories from saturated fat. So if the target is to stay lower, then if you're getting no fat sources anywhere, a tablespoon of butter would put you there. But I wouldn't recommend that because butter contains no essential fats. We do need omega-3 and omega-6. And if we're getting those, we're already probably getting some, we are getting some saturated fats already. So each tablespoon of butter raises your percent saturated fat by about 4%. Now, coconut oil, coconut butter, is more dense in calories. Butter has some water, some proteins, a little bit of lactose in there, and coconut oil butter does not. So each tablespoon of that is about a 6% step up on percent calories from saturated fat. So we know that if you're at risk for cardiovascular disease, closer to 5%, 5 to 10 probably safe in terms of brain health, cancer risks. 10 to 20, we see risks emerge. More than 20, we see very strong risks emerge. And if your diet is already more typical, and say you're getting a third or so of your calories from fat, then each tablespoon of butter is going to put you out of that range. You're probably already there. And if you're on a low-carb paleo diet, you're probably at 20, 30% calories from saturated fat already. That's not uncommon. And every tablespoon of butter and coconut oil is going to put you up by another 4 to 6%. And we know that that's where the mortality and all the risks emerge from. So just wanted to go through the science with you on that. It's a really important topic. And again, the pitfall is binary thinking. Saturated fats are not demons, but they're also not to be idolized. And the big 2015 study that made everyone think they're not that bad, it just showed they were not more dangerous than some really bad junk foods. So it wasn't really time to say, let's build our diets around them. Dr. Christianson here. Take great care of yourself. We'll talk again really soon. Bye-bye.